Chapter 6. By the time the next hearing was scheduled, 3 weeks had passed. Alexander learned the city by patterns rather than streets. The cafe near Abzal's office where the same man sat every afternoon without ordering. The corner by the pharmacy where another leaned against a railing, phone never lifted, eyes always up. The car that idled too long across from his building and vanished the moment Alexander reached the door. They never approached him, they never spoke, they just made sure he noticed. Don't acknowledge them, Abzal advised, that's what they want. The day of the next hearing finally arrived, the courtroom felt smaller than before. The same judge presided, posture rigid, expression unreadable. The interpreter sat closer to the bench this time, papers stacked neatly, pen poised. Layla entered with Max and 2 older men, relatives Alexander assumed, who took their seats with an ease that felt practiced. They did not look around. They did not talk or whisper among each other, they just waited. Then Max saw him. "Papa," Max blurted in desperation, his voice was soft but held a desperation in it. Alexander stood instinctively. Max smiled, the same crooked smile he used when he wanted reassurance, and took a step forward. Layla's hand came down on his shoulder, firm but not rough. "Stay," she said. Alexander moved towards them anyway, crouching so he was level with Max. "Hey, I'm right here." Max bobbed quickly as if afraid the moment would disappear if he didn't secure it. "You came. I told you I would." Layla's grip tightened. "The hearing hasn't started," she said, eyes flicking towards the judge. The judge cleared his throat. "Please take your seats." Alexander obeyed, though every part of him resisted sitting while Max stood just out of reach. The proceedings began with a recap. The judge summarized the filings, the motions, the supplemental evidence. His tone was neutral and careful, a voice that suggested fairness while committing to nothing. Abzal presented first. He outlined the facts plainly again, like the shared custody under U.S. law, lack of consent for international relocation, the sudden removal of Max without notice, the break-in at Alexandra's apartment, the anonymous phone call traced to a member of Layla's extended family. The interpreter translated. Alexander listened closely and noticed the changes. Certain phrases were softened to manipulate the very obvious facts, to make them seem less intriguing than they actually were. Abzal objected. The judge acquiesced once. Noted, but nothing changed. Layla's lawyer spoke next. He was a calm, measured, and confident guy. He framed the move as maternal concern. He cited cultural continuity, family support, educational stability. He emphasized that Max was 8, an age where emotional grounding is essential, and argued that proximity to extended family outweighed geographic inconvenience. "Inconvenience," Alexander muttered under his breath. The judge ignored it. The lawyer acknowledged that Alexander had not been informed beforehand, but suggested that urgency justified it. That a mother's judgment, particularly when acting for a child's well-being, deserved deference. "The father is not excluded," the lawyer said. "He is invited to participate through proper channels." Alexander leaned forward. "She didn't invite me," he said. "She took him." The judge raised a hand. "You will speak through counsel." Abzal stepped in, referencing international conventions, parental consent norms, the psychological harm of abrupt separation. He cited the break-in again. This time the judge responded. "The court recognizes the disturbance," he said. "However, no items were stolen, no injuries reported. No direct evidence connects the incident to the respondent. So, someone just happened to break into my apartment and leave everything behind?" Alexander asked. The interpreter hesitated. The judge frowned. "Please refrain." Layla's lawyer added smoothly, "Speculation cannot replace proof." Alexander sat back, hands clenched. The judge continued. "Under Kazakh family law, a biological parent retains broad discretion in determining a child's residence unless restricted by a local court order. Foreign custody agreements may inform the court's understanding, but they are not binding," Abzal countered. "Then what prevents unilateral removals?" The judge adjusted his glasses. "The expectation of cooperation between parents." Alexander laughed once, sharply and involuntarily, when he understood what exactly was happening. The judge's gaze hardened but proceeded anyway. The court finds no grounds for enforcement at this time, he said. The appropriate course is mediation. The parents are encouraged to reach an agreement in the best interest of the child. The court's reasoning, Abzal later explained, was built on a careful narrowing of facts rather than a denial of them. By calling the case a family matter, the judge had deliberately stripped it of urgency and jurisdiction. The relocation was reframed not as an abduction, but as a parental decision made in the child's interest. The lack of prior consent was acknowledged but presented as a misunderstanding rather than a violation. The break-in was discussed without assigning motive, reducing it to a property disturbance with no material loss. Even the traced phone call was treated as incidental, a warning without a demonstrable link to custody. Each piece of evidence remained intact, but none were allowed to touch each other. They appeared harmless when separated. Together, they would have implied coercion and bad faith. The court's refusal to assemble them was not oversight, it was their method. By isolating facts and avoiding conclusions, the judge preserved the appearance of neutrality while ensuring no institutional responsibility was triggered. Dismissed. Just like that, Layla stood immediately. Max turned back, confusion flickering across his face. He hesitated as if unsure whether he was allowed to move, then slipped free just enough to reach Alexander. Alexander knelt immediately, arms opening without thinking. Max leaned into him, small and warm, his forehead pressing into Alexandra's shoulder the way he used to when he was tired but didn't want to admit it. "I miss you," Max whispered. "I would come anywhere for you," Alexander said, his voice low, steady, meant only for him. He brushed Max's hair back gently, memorizing the weight of him, the way his shoulders had grown broader in just a few weeks. "I'm not done yet, do you hear me?" Max waggled against him. "I knew you'd come." Alexander pulled back just enough to look at him. "Listen to me," he said softly. "No matter what anyone says, you didn't do anything wrong, and I didn't leave you." Max curled his fingers into Alexandra's jacket, holding tight. Alexander smiled, even as his throat tightened as Layla's family approached them. Layla stepped forward then, her hand already reaching. Alexander squeezed Max's hand once more. "I'll be back," he said, "soon." Max looked up at him, serious in the way only children can be. "I'll wait," he said. Alexander shook his head. "Papa," he said. Alexander crossed the aisle before anyone stopped him. He dropped to one knee again, taking Max's hand. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not leaving." Max was pulled away, but he twisted back long enough to wave, his face bright with a faith that hurt more than any ruling. Alexander stayed where he was, watching until the doors closed, until there was nothing left but the lingering presence of a promise, and the unbearable certainty that love alone was not enough to protect him. As he watched them walk out, watched his son disappear behind the courtroom doors, and understood, finally, what the hearing had been: a wicked performance. The court had not denied wrongdoing, it had simply decided that acknowledging it was inconvenient, and in that silence Max slipped further away. The office felt even smaller once the court doors closed behind them. Abzal did not sit immediately. He remained standing by the window, watching traffic move below as if it were more important than what had just happened. Alexander stood near the door, jacket still on, pulse hammering, Max's voice looping relentlessly in his head. "I should apologize," Abzal said finally. Alexander shook his head. "For what? For letting you believe this would be decided by facts." Alexander exhaled sharply and dropped into the chair opposite the desk. "So that's it," he said. "That's justice," Abzal turned slowly. "That is procedure." "They didn't deny anything," Alexander said. "They didn't even disagree with us." "No," Abzal replied. "They acknowledged everything." "Then why?" "Because acknowledgement is not obligation," Abzal interrupted gently. "They recognized the problem. They simply decided it was not theirs to fix." Alexander leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped tightly. "They hid behind technicalities." "They hid behind reasonableness," Abzal corrected, "which is much harder to fight." By shrinking the problem, Abzal continued. "They took something structural and reduced it to a disagreement between parents. Once they label it a family matter, the state no longer has to intervene. It becomes optional." "Inconvenient, you see." Abzal sat at last, folding his hands on the desk. understand this. Kazakhstan's family courts are structured to preserve social order, not individual fairness. A foreign custody dispute threatens both. It raises questions they don't want asked. Like what? Like why a child was taken across borders without consent, like why intimidation followed, like why local families seem untouchable. Abzal's voice remained calm. So they reduce the issue, they call it a disagreement, they suggest mediation, they remove themselves from responsibility. Alexander stared at the desk. What now? Abzal hesitated. Max becomes collateral to stability. The word landed heavily. So what do I do now? Alexander asked. Because I'm not walking away. Abzal bowed slowly. Then the next step is enforcement. Enforcement of what? Alexander was perplexed. They didn't enforce anything. You request mediation through the police, Abzal said. You formally ask for assistance in arranging an agreement, and if Layla refuses, she will, Abzal said simply, and then the police will document it, Abzal said. And that documentation will sit. Alexander let out a humorless laugh. You're telling me to chase paperwork. I'm telling you that staying inside the system is the only way to remain legally present, Abzal said. Anything else will be used against you. He told Alexander that the only immediate step left within the law was to file for a temporary parental agreement, not custody, not relocation, just a formal arrangement that allowed both parents to see Max under defined conditions. It was the court's way of buying time, he explained, of lowering visible conflict without resolving it. If approved, it would force Layla to acknowledge Alexandra's presence and allow scheduled contact, even if limited. It wouldn't bring Max home, but it would prevent him from disappearing entirely. Think of it as a legal tether, Abzal said quietly. As long as that agreement exists, you remain part of Max's daily life. Without it, she can shut you out completely. Alexander listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. Finally, he inhaled deeply and stood abruptly. I'll go now, Abzal acquiesced. I'll wait for your call. The police station smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale air. Alexander waited nearly an hour before anyone acknowledged him. When they did, the officer barely glanced up. Yes, I need to speak about a mediation order, Alexander said carefully. Regarding my son, the officer sighed as if already tired. The court advised mediation, Alexander asserted. That is between parents, the officer said, not police. I'm asking if you can contact the mother, Alexander pressed. To arrange, you must contact her yourself. She won't answer, Alexander said. She refuses all communication, the officer shrugged. Then wait, for what? For agreement. Alexander clenched his jaw. She took my son out of the country without telling me. The officer leaned back slightly. She is his mother, so that makes this acceptable. It makes it legal, the officer said flatly. When Alexander finished telling him all the facts, the man acquiesced once, as if acknowledging a form had been filled correctly, then leaned back in his chair. This is not a police matter, he said evenly. There is no criminal offense here. The child is with his biological mother. Alexander tried to explain about the court, the agreement request, the lack of consent, but the officer raised a hand gently, almost apologetically. You are confusing legal processes, he said. Custody arrangements are handled by the courts. Mediation is handled by the parents. The police do not facilitate family negotiations. Alexander pressed on, asking whether they could at least contact Layla, document her refusal, create a record. The officer shook his head. We cannot compel communication where no crime exists, he said. If the mother chooses not to respond, that is her right. You may file another petition with the court. His tone suggested this was less advice than a way of ending the conversation. When Alexander mentioned the intimidation, the men following him, the break-in, the phone call, the officer's expression didn't change. You have no suspect, he said. No witnesses or physical harm. We cannot open a case based on feelings. He paused, then added, You are a visitor here. I suggest you avoid misunderstandings. A senior officer approached then, glanced briefly at Alexander and spoke a few quiet words in Russian. The younger officer straightened immediately. You have been heard, he said, standing now, but continuing to raise the same issue will not change the answer. His voice hardened slightly. This situation will resolve itself if both parties behave responsibly. You are asked to leave. Alexander stood there for a moment, realizing that nothing he said would be written down, nothing forwarded, nothing followed up. The door was already being opened for him, not aggressively, not forcefully, just firmly enough to make the boundary unmistakable. Alexander stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out. Outside, the air felt colder than usual. Everything seemed impossible. Alexander didn't leave the neighborhood immediately. He stood beneath the overhang where smokers gathered and waited until his breathing evened out. Then he dialed Abzal's number. It rang twice. They sent me away, Alexander said the moment the line connected. Abzal didn't ask how. Tell me exactly what they said. Alexander leaned against the cold wall and recounted it carefully. He mentioned the suggestion to avoid misunderstandings, the warning disguised as advice. When he finished, there was a brief silence on the line. That confirms it, Abzal said finally. Confirms what? That they are aligned, Abzal replied. Not coordinated but aligned. Everyone involved understands which problems are inconvenient. Alexander closed his eyes. They didn't even pretend to help. They never do when the mother is local and the father is foreign, Abzal said, especially not when the family has connections. Intervention creates records and records create risk. So the court points me to the police point me back to the court, Alexander said, and Max stays where he is. Yes, Abzal said, it's a closed loop. Alexander swallowed. What about the intimidation, the break-in? Without a named suspect or visible harm, they can classify it as irrelevant, Abzal said. And by refusing to open a file, they ensure there's nothing for a judge to reference later. Alexander let out a slow breath. They're trying to exhaust me. They're trying to make staying feel pointless, Abzal corrected, so you leave on your own. Alexander stared at the street ahead of him, the city moving as if nothing were wrong. So the agreement you mentioned earlier, does it even matter now? It still matters, Abzal said. It's the only thing keeping you legally visible. It won't bring Max home, but it prevents complete erasure, and if they ignore that too, then we document that, Abzal said. Alexander nodded, though Abzal couldn't see it. You're being careful with your words. I have to be, Abzal replied. Everything you do from this point on will be examined for motive. Alexandra's jaw tightened. I won't do anything reckless. I believe you, Abzal said, but understand this, the law is no longer your shield, it's a narrow path, step off it and they will be waiting. They want you gone so the problem disappears, Abzal replied. Once you leave, Max stays, time will eventually pass and normality settles in, and if I stay. Then they escalate, Abzal said carefully, but never enough to cross a legal line. Alexander leaned against a wall, the city humming around him. So what are my options? Abzal was quiet for a moment. Legally, he said, you keep filing, you request supervised visits and you wait. And realistically, Abzal hesitated. Realistically, they expect you to break first. Alexander straightened. I won't, I know, Abzal said softly. That's why you're dangerous to them. Alexander frowned. Dangerous how? Because you're not reacting emotionally, Abzal said. You are still unpredictable for them, so they aren't sure what to do with you, at least for now. Alexander exhaled slowly. You think they're trying to drive me out with fear alone? Yes, Abzal replied. Fear is cheaper than force. Abzal paused longer this time. They may as well try to provoke a mistake. Alexandra's voice dropped. Like what? A confrontation, an accusation, anything, something that paints you as unstable. Abzal, Alexander said finally, be honest with me, the lawyer sighed. If Max were my son, he said, I would do everything possible within the law for as long as it made sense. And when it stops making sense, Abzal didn't answer immediately. When the law becomes a shield for wrongdoing, he said carefully, people stop trusting it. Alexandra's jaw tightened. So they're betting on me giving up, he said. Yes, and they're wrong. Abzal said nothing. Alexander looked out at the street, the cars, the pedestrians, the ordinary life continuing as if nothing were wrong. They won't bring him back, Alexander said quietly. No matter how many forms I file. Abzal's voice softened. Yes, but I know what you're going to say, Alexander interrupted. To be conscious of my actions as long as I stay here? Yes, and I will, Alexander said, until it's clear that patience only serves them. Abzal inhaled sharply. Be careful. I will, Alexander replied, but I won't leave without my son. The call ended. Alexander stood there for a long time, the weight of the city pressing in on him. So legal justice had failed him, and somewhere between the court's injustice and the police's indifference, Alexander understood the truth he had been avoiding, but saw very clearly. Now, if he wanted Max back, he would have to step outside the system that was designed to keep him powerless, and once he did, there would be no going back.